Thank you for taking out time out of your busy diaries to join Afrika Tikkun this afternoon to listen to some presentations and also take part in discussion about our topic of bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace. This webinar is one of 5 with the overall topic of safeguarding. I'm Leonie van Tonder. I have a very close relationship with Afrika Tikkun as a previous staff member, and presently I'm involved in leadership teaching and coaching. Afrika Tikkun has a long history of caring for the vulnerable. In 2012, a program of caring for the disabled was started in Orange Farm. In 2012, Action Aid funded a gender-based violence program in Diepsloot. In 2014, Action Aid funded a young urban woman program, and this later also included a young urban men program. All these programs started almost as a one-woman crusade and exist now in all 5 of the Afrika Tikkun centers. Since 2019, Afrika Tikkun has been working with 7 local NGOs supported by Comic Relief to assist in developing and implementing action plans that ensure a comprehensive approach to safeguarding across their operations. In all our lives, we do not only look after our children, but also our employees. We sometimes think this is only a woman problem, but statistics reveal that it is also a men problem. In South Africa, bullying and sexual harassment has a most concerning history, and not a day goes past where examples of this does not appear on the news and in our newspapers. This can even lead to suicide, and we had an example recently in Limpopo after a bullying incident. Organizations sometimes take for granted communication guidelines and cues in the workplace. This can result in the tacit acceptance of bullying and/or sexual harassment in the workplace. Organizations therefore need to take considered, decisive, and immediate action around these elements to ensure that their staff are safe and well protected. This webinar will focus on organizational implementation of practices and procedures, and thereby ensuring a culture of accountability and how these play out. During the presentations, you will see some questionnaires popping up sometimes for you to answer, and if there are, we will share the results with you. We assembled a panel of 3 experts to guide us this afternoon, and our first presenter is Bontle Chebe. Bontle Chebe is the HR business practitioner for Baron and a registered industrial and organizational psychologist. Her primary focus is to initiate, implement, and manage the end-to-end human resource function for the organization in order to support the achievement of strategic and operational plans of the business, whilst ensuring compliance with labor-related legislation. Bontle will explain to us what workplace bullying constitutes and the South African law that guides this. As an HR professional, she also has some advice for companies on how to deal with this. Thank you, Bontle. Bonte, will you please talk? Okay.
I was struggling a little bit there because I'm like on 2 monitors. Thank you so much for the welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. And yes, I will be presenting on workplace bullying today. So as the introduction, I do work for Barron. So my perspective or my views, obviously with the private sector and what currently I've experienced in organizations or I've seen as well. So if you can just give me a moment so I can just share my presentation and then just let me know as soon as you guys see it. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. I hope you can't see the one with my notes. Is it fine? Okay, great. All right, so basically my presentation is built on, I want us to unpack a little bit on what is workplace bullying, right? So what is sort of the definition that's out there with regards to that? Also a little bit about what is the laws that we have in the South African context with regards to workplace bullying. And then I also want us to unpack the makeup of a bullying, right? Of a bully. So what does that actually look like? But also how's it played out in the organization and how we're likely to see the behavior there. And then I also want to discuss why does workplace bullying occur? So what are sort of the factors that contribute towards somebody bullying someone in the workplace or the organization and the elements thereof? And then the last thing I want to just highlight is just what organizations should consider with regards to this aspect. Okay, so workplace bullying is the repeated and regular form of behavior of humiliating, criticizing, embarrassing, undermining, victimizing, intimidating or controlling someone within the work environment. So it's basically that bully that we all knew in school, but they're obviously in the work environment, right? It involves regular conflict, arguments, confrontations, and rudeness directed at someone or a group of individuals. So what's interesting about workplace bullying and a bully specifically in the work environment is that they're not always obvious. You can't always see that somebody's actually bullying you. And I will unpack it in the next few slides of what do I mean by that, because I'm also going to speak about the types of bullying, right? And also what we've seen with bullying as well, there is a difference between bullying behaviors repeated over time versus harassment. So when you look at harassment and you're looking at bullying, harassment is usually of incidents or occasion that has occurred, whereas bullying is repeated, right? And is directed at a single person or a group, as I said. So I'm struggling here with my slides. I don't know what's going on here. Okay, so when we look at the South African legislation, right? The South African legislation does not have a specific definition or laws enforcing around workplace bullying. However, the only act that is sort of closely related to sort of defining or unpacking to us what is bullying and what is workplace bullying is with regards to the Employment Equity Act. So the Employment Equity Act says no person may unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against an employee in any employment policy or practice on one or more grounds, including race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, family responsibilities, ethnicity or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, HIV status, conscious belief, political opinion, culture, language, and behavior. It further goes on to say that harassment of an employee is a form of unfair discrimination and is prohibited on any one or a combination of grounds of unfair discrimination listed in subsection 1. So when we actually look at the labor laws and all the acts that we currently have in the South African context, as I said, this is the only one that is sort of kind of hinting and closely related to saying bullying, right? Because it is a form of discrimination, because you are, and obviously there's multiple reasons as to why somebody would bully you or target you. And those reasons could be one or more of the ones that are listed that we are seeing right here. So when we look at the law, it could be assumed that workplace bullying forms part of a harassment. And this could either be physically, emotionally, or verbal harassment. So this is where actually we kind of see that. And there has been a 1 or 2 case laws which has been escalated to the CCMA, which we have seen that it actually once upon the case was investigated was due to bullying. And this is where they actually related on in terms of the Employment Equity Act to say that workplace bullying and harassment are closely related to each other, right? Because as I said, it is some form of trying to isolate a person or discriminate them against them, whether it's directly or indirectly in some form of way. So if we look at what makes up a bully, right? So, I mean, I said it earlier on in the definition of what a bully actually does. It's sort of, I actually watched this video the other day, which is actually looked at the psychopaths in the workplace, right? And it said that about 1% of the world actually have psychopaths in the workplace, right? And that's what bullies are sometimes, right? It can be sort of psychological, but most of the time it's due because of unrelated issues. Some bullies have insecurity issues that they project and deflect on another person who they seem to be a threat to them, right? So what do they get from this? That's the question, right? So a bully finds joy or pleasure in criticizing, hurting, being cruel, callous, selfish, possessive, disrespectful, abuses, or they lack empathy or guilt, right? So I go on to say here that they enjoy creating chaos and confusion. So some bullies, and what I've also seen in our workplace is that, as I said, it's sort of the person doesn't want the attention on them. So in order for the attention to be deflected by someone else or something else, they have to find their victim, right? Who can they pinpoint so that no one can actually see their incompetence? We actually because my organization, we are a retail and wholesaler organization, and we have an operations element of it. And often there you'll hear the different languages, the way people engage with each other. They might swear at each other, and then they'll go on to say, well, it's operations. That's how we communicate with each other. But it's things like that that actually creates the bully, right? By making it the norm. And so, as I'm saying, a bully, right, tries to create the chaos and confusion because they're trying to push their own personal agendas, right? Because while everybody else around them is emotionally distracted and distorted, right? They can continue with whatever they want and push their own personal, as I said, agenda. And it might be because of power, right? Because they want people to follow them. And maybe you might be the vocal person who are the exception who challenges them. It might be because of prestige. And it also might be to influence their environment and the position that they're in. So I'm gonna, no one has to answer this, but I also want you guys to just ask yourself if you have ever said something you mean or offensive to a colleague. I think we all have, right? But the difference between us is that we might say, oh no, it was just a mistake, or it was just an innocent joke, right? As we said, bullying is about repetition, right? And continuously targeting somebody. So the difference between our sort of joke or mishaps or whatever and bullying is the intent. A bully wants to humiliate, belittle, intimidate, or embarrass somebody because of whatever views or the way they look, or that they are not constituted as that, or they don't agree with the way things are done in the organization. Right? So here I also say that there are 4 types of sort of workplace bullies. You've got the constant critic, right? So the constant critic never finds anything that you do right. Right? You do a little mistake, or even if you may perceive that you did exceptional work, they might always find or pinpoint something that they can find to say that, you know what, something is wrong, and they want to embarrass you. That's the constant critic. You can never please them, no matter how hard you work, no matter how many long hours that you work through the night. It might be your manager, it might be your colleague, whoever it is, you're just not perfect. Then there's the sly one. Remember at the beginning, I said that a workplace bully or bully in general, not all of them are obvious. Some of them you won't necessarily think, is it bullying or not? Because they might be the two-headed snake. So the two-headed snake use passive aggressive tactics. So usually they are the ones to welcome you at the beginning when you join the organization. They will hug you, they will embrace you, make you feel comfortable. And as soon as, and they will usually do this in front of an audience because they want to come across as though, you know, they are a welcoming person and they're happy for you to be there. They are likely to then actually see how do you sort of, what is your weaknesses? And they are likely to sort of study you, right? And as soon as they have an opportunity, they are the ones to stab you in the back, right? So yeah, and then they'll obviously expose you privately and, you know, just make jabs at you. So it is, those ones are quite confusing. We have one or two of them in our organization as well, but you must be careful to think to yourself, but does he always say that to me? Or does he always say that to another person? So a bully is just about, is it really a joke? Or does the person continuously target you, right? And make you feel uncomfortable? Then there's another bully called the gatekeeper. This type of bully also quite dangerous because they know you rely on them in order for them to execute, in order for you to execute your work. They have the information, but they don't want to share it with anybody else. They want you to come and sweet talk them. We actually used to have one in our team a couple of years ago. And it was always such a struggle because one would always think to yourself, damn, how am I going to approach her today? Like, I really need to just like pat her, you know, just go and please her. What, should I buy her something today? Should I, you know, say she's wearing a nice dress today? So you literally have to think to yourself, how am I going to approach her in order for her to assist me? And it was because of, at the time, we have this payroll system that we use with Sage. And she basically was the expert, if I can put it that way. And she really didn't want to train the rest of the team so we could all have the same information or level of understanding as her. So at the beginning, we used to rely a lot on her, right? And she would only give us little information so that we can come back and ask for more information. Sometimes this might be your manager, right? Who doesn't give you the full details as to what the expectations are in terms of what you need to deliver on, unrealistic deadlines. And then you have to think to yourself, and then when you do present something, it's not good enough. And you just think to yourself, but you didn't give me all that information that you expected, right? And then, yeah, they like to strike at a person who's greatly vulnerable because they know that you actually need them, as I said, in order to function. Then there's the last one is the screaming mini, right? So this one, they want the audience. This is the obvious bully that you can see a mile away, right? So they actually try to embarrass you in front of a crowd because they want everyone else to team up on their side and be against you. So they're the ones to actually, while there's a meeting, just walking and storming and say, you know, why wasn't A, B, and C completed the way I wanted? Instead of having a private conversation with you, addressing the issue privately, they want an audience. They're the ones who are usually going to yell and scream and potentially even throw things, right? So it's like sort of like a baby throwing their toys out the cot in the workplace, right? And that's just basically how they are. So bullies usually, they, as we said, they target employees that they feel maybe threatened by it, who are different. Sometimes it's even people that are quite vocal, right? Because they know that, you know, this person has a strong followership, or people trust what this person or individual would actually say. They would target that individual because they actually want the influence on their side, right? And then they attempt to actually embarrass you in that sort of way. But as I said, mostly, which I've also seen in my organization, is that the bully is because they are not capable or inadequate to achieve their targets and work well, right? So they want to deflect so nobody can actually see that they don't know what they're actually doing. We actually have one employee like that. But they want to deflect the attention elsewhere so they're not exposed. So what do? Then they target the people that they feel that are vulnerable and that they can actually target to that. So it's very important to sort of see these types of tactics that these bullies would use. As I said, some of them are quite obvious, you can see it, but some of them are not as obvious. It's up to you if you are ever in a bully situation or being bullied. It's up to you to decide to say, as I said, just ask yourself simple questions as that, am I the only one that's being targeted? How do I feel about the engagement, how the person is responding to me? How often do they sort of joke and say these statements in front of other people, or even me in privately? How does it make me feel? So that you can actually see if it's a bully tactic or not, because some of it, as I said, is not obvious. So basically, why does bullying occur, right? So when I thought about this, I'm like, you know what, most bullies exist within the organization because of unassertive management style. So what do I mean by this? Sometimes it's a senior manager, right? You report it as the head of department and say, you know what, I'm being bullied. Then there'll be excuses like, I'm sure she or he didn't mean it that way. Oh, that's just Buntle. Buntle responds that way. You're looking too much in towards it. So sometimes organizations, and it does happen, people have favorite employees. And so whenever there's a concern or complaint on the person that they sort of, is their favorite, then they actually want to brush it aside and say, no, it can't be, right? So they're afraid to actually address the bully and confront the bully to say, you know, ex-employee actually came and had questions about your behavior. You know, is it true or not, right? So yeah, they like to just just leave it alone. The other thing is about cultures that accept bullying as an aspect of doing business. I gave you the example to say that, especially in operations, they will swear at each other and then afterwards say, no, but that's just operations. That's how things work in the warehouse. But it's really not. That's not how it should be, but it becomes the norm. And if you don't accept that sort of language and that sort of engagements with other people, you don't know how it's coming across from other people who feel uncomfortable with that, right? So sometimes that's just how business actually coins that. And they turn a blind eye, you know? So when it is raised, it's swept under the rug and covered up with, covered up to say, well, that's just the way things work here. So get used to it. Things like that. And when people actually speak that way, you just know that something's actually wrong here. As I said, another thing, organizational cultures that embrace extreme conformity. If you want to be part of the group and join us, this is how we do things, and you're just going to have to accept it. And there's some things that you will see as unethical practices that you'll be afraid to actually voice out because of you need to conform, right? And no one else wants to stand up to the bully, especially if they're in the senior position. Unclear code of conduct and rules of engagements. This is a big one here. Whenever you connect with your employees, also with your, because also in our business, we have suppliers and clients, you need to establish what is acceptable and unacceptable engagements of rules. How do we present ourselves? How do we communicate with external clients, but also internally, what does that look like to us? Negative and stressful work environments. This we can see from people derailing sometimes, right? People actually we all get stressed out, right? But it's again, if you don't have sort of those principles or the foundation laid to say, how do we deal with such? People actually just behave the way they feel it is. Autocratic or authoritarian rather than participatory leadership styles, right? This is how we do things. This is, you can't question the way we do things. Instead of engaging employees and actually in the conversation of how do we conduct ourselves, how do we accept behavior within our organization, right? But yeah, just looking for, yeah, okay. And then the last thing, I'm also looking at my time. The last thing in closing is with regards to what I'm saying organizations need to consider. Being clear on the acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. The clearest things to actually draw this from is values and code of conduct. In our organization, we went through an exercise about 2 years ago where we revamped our values. Our previous values was off-the-shelf values. What I mean by that, it did not depict what our employees actually experience and how they communicate and engage with each other. So values and code of conduct is a blueprint, I would say, for your employees, but also externally with the people that you engage with, and say, this is how we engage with one another. Calling out the bullying and establishing zero tolerance. So some companies actually, which is a great thing, is to make it clear towards the business that we have a zero tolerance for bullying. And if there is a bully, these are the different avenues to actually go about it. There's grievance procedures that an individual can do. I also list here assertive management skills, right, for employees, but also managers. That's quite important because you need to learn how to set healthy boundaries, right? And how to push back a bit and not just accept anything that's thrown your way. Emotional intelligence training. This is a big, especially within our business when we recruit for senior management. IQ is very, very critical because you need to be able to control your emotions, right, in the workplace. So that is very quite important. Anti-harassment policies, as I said, encourage buy-in and visibility messaging from top down. That actually will go for the zero tolerance. Investigate the complaints. As I said earlier on, sometimes it's pushed on the rug. It depends who actually raises it. Grievance procedure, I said it. So then I also said, approach the CCMA. So if your organization does not have a grievance procedure or these policies in place, then what you should do if you are being bullied is that you need to actually build your case and approach the CCMA. They can then intervene to be a third party to mediate between the situation at hand. And then the last thing I said, create a humane working environment through civility training. Civility training is basically taking us back to being the core of what a human being is. Practicing respect and actually saying, what does that look like in our organization? And not only focusing on eliminating harassment, but also having those boundaries in place. Cool, that's it. Sorry, I was rushing towards the end because of the time. But yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you, Bontle. Will you please just remove your presentation?
Okay.
Thanks a lot. I think Bontle pointed out a very important aspect of organizational culture, something that we should always attend to, the acceptance of negative behavior tacitly. In other words, you don't do something about it, so the negative behavior is considered as acceptable. Positive role modeling, so important. And as we say in legitimate leadership, the standard you walk by is the standard that you get. So if you don't do something about matters that you don't agree with, you are going to get it again and again. Thank you very much, Bonte. That was very interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, our next presenter is Charlton Ziervogel. Charlton is the Managing Director of Community Organization Resource Center, who draws together 4 organizations collectively called the South African Slum Dwellers International Alliance. This is an alliance of 2 community-based organizations and 2 NGOs. Carlton and his team have been working on safeguarding for this alliance, which has an interesting mix of formal and informal processes requiring innovative approaches to develop policies that can work across all the partner organizations. Carlton will talk to us about the complexity of working relations and some of the processes undertaken to develop safeguarding. Thank you, Carlton. Over to you. Sorry, we can't hear you. That's better.
Can you hear me now?
That's better. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you once again for giving me the
You're off again. Colton, we can't hear you. Colton, we cannot hear you. There was one moment of sound and then it also disappeared.
Let me try and fix the situation.
That's better. Now I can hear you.
Is that better?
That's better. Thank you. I'm afraid you have to repeat everything you've said up until now.
No problem, no problem. But a
Thank
technical
you.
issues there with this laptop. So I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this event today. Thank you, Leonie, for the introduction. As was mentioned, my name is Charlton. I'm the Managing Director of Cork. And today I'm going to be speaking specifically to safeguarding and the aspect of bullying. I think Bontle's presentation was a good run-up to mine because the case study that I'm going to present today, speaking about ourselves, is just sharing a little bit about our journey as an organization and where we are in that process. And I could resonate quite a bit with some of the examples and steps that that Bontle shared. And so it will be interesting to share that with you. So I thought I'd start a little bit by speaking about who we are, because it does make our situation a little bit unique and complex. So you heard that I'm actually the director of an organization called Cork. And Cork is a support NGO. So we're an NGO, NPO, and we sit inside of something that's called an alliance. And our alliance is the South African Slum Dwellers International Alliance. And so we're made up of two support NGOs. So there's another support NGO in this alliance called Twoheaded. And then we've got two community networks. That is one called the Federation of the Urban and Rural Poor, and the other one is called the Informal Settlement Network. And together we form this thing called the SASDI Alliance. Now, what was very useful and interesting with Bontle's presentation is she spoke quite a bit about an organization and the kinds of things that can happen inside and the kinds of steps that you need to take. But what's interesting is in our scenario is that, yes, Cork is on its own an organization, but our work is integrally linked to these other three partners. And Uchani Fund, the other NGO, has a very formal setup and registration. So the two of us have that very formal arrangements, but then we've got these two social movement partners. And these two social movement partners are community-based organizations, grassroots movements, and effectively sit technically outside of our areas of influence in terms of our organizational policies and procedures. So that does make quite an interesting dynamic. So we spread across the country, and it does mean that we operate in different scenarios where there might be different cultures involved. We've got our formal NGO presence in 3 provinces, but we actually have this operation stretching across 8. And it does mean that the way that we work is a little bit complicated, and it does mean that issues related to safeguarding and bullying has showed itself in different ways across our situation. So why is it such a complex setup, and why I thought I'd like to share this experience with you this afternoon is because on the NGO side, we have very formal structures for how we operate. Some of the things that Bontle spoke about, we've got in place. We have our policies and procedures manual. We have all these things that guide us. We have opportunities for how staff get brought into the organization and get onboarded, and we have methods for how staff sort of get trained and acclimatized to our working environment. The reality is that we also sit with a scenario where the bulk of our work involves connecting with these community groups and community-based organizations. And what's unique in our setup is that we take the lead from these community groups and community organizations. So it's a little bit different to normal NGO setups, where effectively we assist these two social movements to drive their agenda. So it means that we take a lot of lead from these community organizations. Leadership in those organizations have a big say in our processes. And in effect, there's a way that they define the kind of work that we do. This comes from a historical situation linked to leadership. And so I think, again, it links back to some of the things that Bontle spoke about, in that this setup means that leadership inside of the NGO, like myself, we don't have sole control necessarily in terms of how these things might unfold. And then we also inherit the historical relationship that was set up between the social movements and the NGO. When I speak about the historical relationship, and this is why I put this methodology slide up for you, just so that you can understand, our work has been, in a sense, a reaction to what many consider the failure of normal development sector work to actually make real improvements for the poor. And so our process focused primarily on a more grassroots bottom-up approach. And it did mean that from the initial stages, there was this tension set up between professionals and community groups. And to this day, we still have the after effects of how that initial relationship was set up, where it was this idea that in the past, professionals have failed communities in development sector, and they've got to change the way they operate. So it does mean if that kind of setup is not managed very carefully, you can get a situation where you find that there's an expectation from one side that the other party will behave in a certain way. And in some cases, what this has meant for us is that people might think that you are there to be ordered around, or in some cases, and that's what I'll be sharing, bullying can happen between community leaders and professionals. And in the same way, the reverse can happen, where professionals might think that they need to stamp their authority in certain spaces. So some of the problem areas that can happen is that we, because of our setup, we can have a situation where staff and social movement leaders have come into loggerheads. And we find that there's almost like a type of bullying that comes from the space where, having shared with you the kind of setup that we have, where there's this expectation that you will almost like inevitably follow whatever instructions are given. And even though the initial setup was not meant to be like that, the idea was to set up a professional team that can ask the right kinds of questions inside of community spaces, but that the community's leadership and members can still take the lead. What that's meant is, and again, Bontle's presentation, it was brilliant how she could remind me of the situations that have happened, is that we've had instances where between staff, a leader who might have quite a bit of power inside of the social movement ends up bullying a staff member because it links to the way that a program is delivered. And the kind of bullying that can result is that you get into a situation where progress can be withheld or halted, cooperation can be stopped, and this creates a situation where staff members can end up feeling undervalued or end up feeling like they cannot even complete the work that they needed to. We also have situations where you can find inside of these community spaces that there can be bullying between leadership and ordinary members. And I think the difficulty that we've always faced, and that's one of the key points that I wanted to share today, is that on the NGO side, the professional side, we have our code of conduct in place. We've had participatory process for developing those values that people buy into. But then because of a process that we support that's informal, that sits inside of an area that is not as structured in terms of policies and procedures, you find that it's difficult to have everybody on the same page when it comes to accountability and being able to speak about consequences for behavior that doesn't match up to necessarily the values. And we might have an agreed upon set of values, but it doesn't mean that this is enforced or necessarily adopted by our social movement partners. We also find that because of our different communication platforms, that you find different scenarios where bullying has taken place. So we found that there's an interface in the actual office space where community and professional staff might be meeting, and some of the things that Bontle described around meeting spaces becoming areas of conflict, where you see different bullying styles come out has happened. We also find that communication platforms, especially through social media and WhatsApp, gets used quite a bit, and we've had situations where between professional staff and community members, there has been degrees of bullying that could have happened over WhatsApp groups, and then the other area of communication that we often have, that is around emails, and sometimes you find that communication that comes via that email, even between staff members and community members who have had that access, has resulted in what we could say is degrees of bullying and even fighting. And so it becomes what has become tricky for us, and I think I shared this around the history of how the relationship was set up, and it's meant that it was difficult to manage the different power relations between and within organizations, and then to also come to a common understanding of how we could tackle this. And so the process of safeguarding and the idea of trying to tackle different issues, of which bullying is one of them, came into our space. And yes, we started the process by looking at the NGO staff first, but I think we also realized that there was a need to take this to a much broader level, considering the way that we work and the way that we interact with our social movements. Over the past year and a half, this has meant that we've rolled out a process where we firstly identified that we needed to take this opportunity of training to both NGO staff and social movement. For a support organization like Afrika Tikkun, this meant looking at 12 regions where we required this training. And in each of those 12 regions, we looked at 3 key areas that we wanted to explore. And that was workplace communication. And even saying that workplace communication was tricky because in our scenario, workplace, yes, there are only 3 physical offices, but there are also the spaces where we work in together in communities across 8 provinces in our country. We then also had sessions on safeguarding. And with our social movement partners, what was interesting in this respect was that often people were not aware that that sometimes there was bullying that had been experienced, and even that they were doing the bullying. And so this process of unpacking that and having an opportunity to speak about that in safe spaces that was created was quite valuable for our organization. We also had workshop sessions on sexual harassment. I'm not going to be going deeper into that particular topic, but also to say that the complexity for this, obviously in our situation, is also quite tricky because of the nature of the relationship between our very formally structured NGO and the social movements. So some of the steps beyond that is to look at our own internal team and be trained a little bit more in depth around that particular area of focus, the safeguarding focus. And the idea there was to create a really solid basis inside of our own organization, but then also to carry that across into the 2 social movements and the other partner NGO. And the idea is to develop a task team with 2 members each, that will specifically look at forming a safeguarding task team. Now, what's interesting is that in some of the examples that Bontle described, we've had incidents that have happened, and because of this nature of the informal process and the formal colliding, there's been no means or mechanism for there to be any repercussions or any way of tackling this, because there's been no agreed upon format or space. And the end result is that one of the things that we've decided to focus on as the Alliance, and it sounds like a very simple thing, but it's something quite powerful for us, is to have a code of conduct that stretches across all of our platforms, I mean, all of our organizations. And our organization prides itself in a deeply participatory process, and it means that this task team will have to work with each of the partners involved to ensure that we get the voices from all sides to participate in the crafting of this code of conduct. And it's tricky because some of the spaces that we operate in, like I said, it's community spaces, it's working with people who are effectively volunteers, and sometimes it's the social movements themselves working in spaces where they won't even have the structure of the NGO or its systems in place to guide. So we need to come up with a code of conduct that is easily understandable, that is also able to be applied across these various spaces. But at the same time, this team, and it was something that was coined by a couple of our senior leaders, they looked at this team as almost being like a team of elders, even though they won't necessarily be elders, who could then help with taking on these incidents as they popped up. And that is something that we'll be working on over the next while. Let me just move to this one. So in terms of the closing remarks, so one of the things that's been extremely difficult in our process is that it's always difficult to bring in a new process. So to give you a parallel example, about 4 or 5 years back, the topic of monitoring, evaluation, and learning came into our space, and this was almost seen as swear words in our space before, but we needed to wrestle with it, and we went through a process where today we can speak about leaders who have become quite comfortable with terms like baselining and monitoring and reporting. And so, yes, safeguarding is a term that came up that was new, and everybody initially tries to, the first thing they think about is the safety part of it, but then expanding that topic and really understanding what it has been about has opened our eyes to understand that it's of course, it's much broader than that. And when we started looking at it, we actually looked at our past and realized that often the problem that we have in our alliance is that there's this breakdown in communication, and that often happens because there might be these incidents of friction, and that incidence of friction, which has played itself out in bullying in certain cases, has meant that there's been breakdown in relationships. And so we started realizing that this is a very powerful tool that we actually need to develop and also bring into our culture. And carry it forward. So we've seen it as a critical tool in trying to address some of the challenges that we faced as an alliance over the while. We've noted that the lack of these tools meant that we couldn't deal with certain situations effectively. We shared that there were actually examples where we realized in meetings that bullying was taking place, and because we didn't have the mechanisms to tackle it on the spot or to know how to react because of this nature of the relationship between our community organizations and ourselves, it was left unattended. And we ended up in a scenario where people began to feel more and more that no actions were being taken. So we find ourselves in a very interesting space now where, yes, we don't have everything perfect. We're walking along this path. But we are learning as we go along, and we're getting the opportunity to develop something that will actually work quite well for ourselves across our 4 organizations, and give us an opportunity to focus much better on our work and try and move some of these very complicated conflicts into the spaces where they can be resolved appropriately. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'd like to pause there.
Thank you very much, Tolton. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us. Working in communities from the outside is never easy because the expectations are obviously so different. Our expectations and the community's expectations, somewhere along the line, we hope that it meets. but we know that's a long, hard road. So thank you for sharing your experience with us. I have no doubt that we will, try and adapt some of your processes with going forward. Okay, Kulisa Social Institution is a multi-award winning non-profit organization which was registered in 1997. Its aim is to empower vulnerable children, youth, those who are marginalized, and the community at large to unlock their full potential in order to develop resilient pathways and skills that lead to a sustainable future. Kulisa operates nationally, employ over 180 staff members through 16 offices, and work in approximately 150 communities in collaboration with 350 NGO partners. Impact on the lives of close to 100,000 people per annum. That's a mouthful. Streetscapes, a Kulisa flagship program, provides a model for sustainable urban regeneration and addresses the neglected needs of this very vulnerable population. Departing from typical emergency relief type of services for the homeless, Streetscapes is structured to address their multidimensional needs. We are privileged this afternoon to have with us Jessie Leitner, Strategic Partnership Manager at Kulisa Social Solutions and Manager of Streetscapes Program, working with chronic homelessness in Cape Town. Jessie has spearheading development of safeguarding policy and practice at Kulisa together with head office staff over the past 12 months. Jessie will discuss with us the organization's approach, and she said that she also has some a real case to share with us and to learn from. Jessie, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Leonie, and thank you, Bontle and Charlton. It was great listening to both of your presentations. Let me see if I can get my screen to share. It should be working now, right? So yes, so Kulisa Social Solutions and Streetscapes, the project that I manage, they're both examples of what we call trauma-informed services. This may be a little bit new term for some people, but what it basically means that all our programs are designed to understand and take into account traumas and the impact of traumatic effects that can have on a person. And we specifically focus on helping people with behavioral health issues that are due to trauma. And these issues can be many, many different kinds of things. They include substance misuse, mental health issues, or what kind of the media at least has coined antisocial behavior. And these kinds of issues are very typical for the homeless population that me and my staff work with. Now, when you work with a highly vulnerable group like deeply traumatized people, it kind of means that at work we are facing multiple challenges on a daily basis. And safeguarding and the help of Afrika Tikkun has been amazing for us because it kind of helps us ensure that our clients who we work with, but also staff, are feeling safe and are treated with kind of the utmost care that's so important. If there is no safety, there's basically no recovery or healing. So we have to make sure that we're not harming anybody, and sometimes you do it in an unintentional way. So I want to raise today a kind of a strange incident that could be categorized under sexual harassment, but I want you all to think about, how do you feel? Would it be that? Because sometimes it might not be so easy to define what constitutes sexual harassment. We all know the typical sexual harassment, and I think we all know also how unfortunately typical it is to workplaces. But this is an interesting one that made us all also think. So yeah, if you feel comfortable, pop your views into the chat box whether you think this was sexual harassment or not. So we offer different services to help our clients and staff to deal with the stress in their life. Various debriefing, counseling things, but also yoga. We've got this retired yoga teacher. She's in her 70s, and she comes to one of our offices twice a week and offers movement and kind of mindfulness classes. The goal kind of these classes is to create a sense of safety. It's kind of like she's got this gentle music, there's movement, breathing exercises, stretches. We do this in a local hall. And one morning when our teacher walked into the class, she dropped her keys on the floor. And she bent over to get them, but this was very close to an elderly male volunteer who has been volunteering with us for almost a year. Now he was sitting on the floor in the front row. The group has been going on for many, many months. People are very friendly with each other. So when the teacher noticed that this man in the front row looked a little bit startled when she kind of suddenly bent, right in front of him, she made a joke. She said, "Oh, don't worry. I'm not planning to give you a blowjob." And she was just laughing afterwards. And the class started. Later in that class, the teacher, something that she does often, was helping this particular man to correct a yoga pose. So she was holding his waist and just gently kind of supporting him into a correct position. Later that day in our office, the man had a very severe panic attack. He was shaking badly, almost like he was having a fit, and he started hitting his head kind of uncontrollably against the office wall. We took him to a doctor. He was given something to calm down. The next day when he came to the office, he first of all informed the management that he wants to lay a safeguarding incident, a complaint. We've got a procedure, set procedure and kind of reminders on the wall how one can do it. But he also was adamant that we need to fire this yoga teacher. Now I want to give you a little bit background to the case. This elderly man is receiving SASSA grant. He suffers from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. And as you may know, this is a mental health condition. And his is resulting from childhood sexual abuse that continued for long. But also he was exposed to war and combat later in his life. Now in his case, this unwelcome touch and sexual language, particularly from somebody who is regarded to be in a dominant position, even if it's a yoga teacher, it's a teacher, it led to this re-traumatization. And basically what this is, it can be a real physical experience with all the symptoms that I described, like a full fight or flight response. And because this condition with him is so severe, it stops him from being able to work normally, and hence the SASSA grant. So what's the sexual harassment? I mean, these things are not always so easy. Obviously, the incident involved now this teacher making a sexual joke. And sexual jokes can be many. It can be just a little joke containing sexual language, but it also could be a sly remark that's aimed at someone in particular. This could also be jokes that are told so everybody can hear it. So you're telling it to your buddy, but you're telling it so loud that everyone can hear. Sexual jokes could also be seen as being completely appropriate. These are just the things we do. However, in a workplace, it's not really the right place for sexual jokes. And sometimes these can actually constitute sexual harassments. Now at Kulisa, each of our offices has developed a code of conduct. And this is an example of Streetscape's code of conduct. We wanted to create this, not just a list of what you can't do, but kind of do's and don'ts. And we're not going to go through it in particular, but it's got different themes that are relevant to our staff and situations that we have experienced. Communication around bullying, physical contact, sexual behavior, and how to be a better team player. Now, I don't know why it There we go. Now it allowed me to do this. Then we also have a system. So how would a staff member or a client lay a complaint against something that they feel was inappropriate? We've divided these in complaints and incidences and safeguarding incidences, because these can be a little different. And this was the route that this volunteer gentleman followed. So what happened in that yoga class, it violated our code of conduct, specifically the parts that relate to all of us committing to conducting communication in a professional manner, and also refraining from making any sexual remarks, comments, advances, or flirting. So we followed our own guidelines, how we dealt with this incident. And what we do is we first always hear both parties, but separately, to ensure that there's no more traumatization that can happen. The people are always told what our code of conduct is, what has been violated, and how staff safety and protection in general are paramount of importance to us. So we met with the male and explained what his rights in the workplace are. We thanked him also for laying a complaint about the incident. And it's interesting, like something as severe that what he experienced, he was petrified that we were going to fire him because of what had happened. So he was very happy to hear that that's not the case, that we understand that this was inappropriate and we are willing to support him. We would say that we are willing to help him if he does want to lay a charge, as he was saying at some point. We do that as peer support services. He can receive counseling from our social worker or an external service provider if he feels that's better. And obviously he's not needing to join these classes in the future. Now, the male explained to us that when he's triggered, he actually can't control his emotions or judge situations well. He said now that he's at time to calm down, he doesn't want to lay a charge or get anyone fired, but he doesn't want to see the person. He's not ready for it. He knows she wants to apologize, but he's just not ready for it. When we met with the yoga teacher, we reminded her of what our code of conduct is and what parts she had violated. And she explained that her joke, and this is often the case, she said she was just trying to make a joke in the light of trying to fit in. We kind of, we deal with so many issues that she thought that being a little rougher and, gave her a little bit of street credibility. But she fully acknowledged that it was completely inappropriate and had caused harm, and that she absolutely should have known better. She's been very deeply apologetic about it and regretful, and was willing to do anything that it takes to resolve the issue, but fully respects the fact that the male person is not ready to face her yet. We also had a separate meeting with everybody who was in that class to just ask how they experienced it and what happened later in the office, and remind them that we need to kind of hold and respect the rights of these both individuals and try stop this incident from going further, that anybody would make fun of either one of them, because it could just get worse. So what constitutes sexual harassment? It's not an easy one, but the key there is always whatever is felt like unwelcome behavior. So in this case, something that many people would have said, oh, that's okay, it's just poor choice, but it's not sexual harassment, it wasn't intentional. It still made the other person feel offended, humiliated, and intimidated, and it's not okay. The spectrum of sexual harassment basically is very broad. It can start with just generally not very offensive language, like, people comment on your hair or your dress, but it also obviously includes strong sexual misconduct like coercion or assault. So when we deal with things like jokes, we got to be careful that when a joke is accompanied by perhaps sexually toned gestures or are repeated at one person, they truly can constitute sexual misconduct. And because sexual harassment is not always the obvious case, I think we learned that it might be helpful also for other organizations or teams to think what their situation specifically is in terms of where are the lines that should not be crossed in their organization? How do we handle comments and behaviors that are offensive? What do you do afterwards? And how do we start talking about something like sexual misconduct at work so we could start preventing it? Because these are often difficult conversations to have. So yeah, a joke that for one person is just a joke, for another person it can be a very painful reminder of some of the worst things that have happened. And we certainly learned that it's not always the most obvious thing that comes up when we think of sexual harassment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessie. I have a question for you.
Shoot.
Let me just get it out of chat here. Do you think that we need to refrain from all jokes in the workplace, or more specifically, sexual jokes?
I think it would be a very dull environment if all the jokes would be taken away. I mean, I think humor, especially in our case, is one of the ways that we make the atmosphere lighter, and we laugh a lot in our teams, and it's very healing. I think this joke was particularly crude because it was offensive, but it was so directed at a person, and also at a person that happened to have this very unfortunate background. So no, I don't think all jokes must go. I think we must just be mindful. What is appropriate at home and with people that you know well might not be appropriate in a professional setup like work.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Bontle, and we will have to just give her a minute there because our friend load shedding kicked her out, and she might just have a problem in getting to the question, but I'm going to read it in the meantime. And it was a request of, can you please go back to the difference between harassment and bullying and how they linked?
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay, so I would say sort of the similarities between harassment and bullying. The first.
Sorry, Buntle, you're not very clear. Can you just pick up your volume there, please?
I don't know what happened. Can you hear me now?
That's better. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't know what happened, but anyways. So as I was saying, I think the common sort of similarities between bullying, first of all, and harassment is that both of them need some kind of power over another individual, right? And some kind of control that they want to have on the other person. And then I think the clear sort of distinguishes between the harassment and bullying, right? So harassment is almost majority of the time when we hear these cases, it's a strong physical contact into someone's personal space. So the person will want to touch you on the back or whatever, or literally try to some form of into your personal space. So there's physical contact in the harassment. Whereas bullying, if we look at it, it's almost always psychological, right? So the person is more vocalized, it's not necessarily physical touch. So they want to belittle you, they want to humiliate you. So it's mostly in that with regards. So it's more psychological, whereas harassment, we see it as more physical. Also, another thing is that harassment may occur maybe once or several times, but sort of the individual knows that they're being harassed, right? It's sort of you, as I'm saying, it's stalking, whatever the case may be, right? Whereas bullying, it's not always obvious. The target might not only realize initially that they're being bullied, because as I said, sometimes bullying, it's not always obvious. It's not always a person continuously shouting at you in front of everybody that you'll regard it as, you know, or your alarm bells will go off and say, hang on, I'm being bullied, right? So that's the other thing. And then harassment as well, the person the aggressor, right, attempts to possess the person or the target, right? Whereas when bullying, the person actually sort of tries to control and dominate you, right? Psychologically, breaking you down, doubting yourself and your skills, making you feel like there's something wrong or you're different when you're really not different, but sort of they start to play that mind game with you, whereas harassment, we don't see that much. So I would say that's sort of the differences between the two of them. Okay, hope you guys heard me.
Thank you. I think the next, you maybe answered half of the next question, but I'll give it to you in any case. If you are a manager of someone who is being bullied in the workplace, is the onus of responsibility on the employee to deal with the bullying, or on the manager to call it out, or both? Or is there an alternative approach you would suggest?
Okay. Can you please repeat the first part of the question? Sorry, I missed that.
Okay. If you are a manager of someone who is being bullied in the workplace, is the onus of responsibility on the employee to deal with the bullying, or on the manager to call it out, or both? Or is there an alternative approach you would suggest?
Okay, I think that's a great question. So, as I said, bullying is not always obvious. So to sort of expect a manager to assume that you've been bullied, because remember, what I might consider as bullying, the next person might not consider that as bullying. So to sort of have that expectation on the manager to say, you know what, X person had made this remark and make me feel uncomfortable. And also bullying, remember I said it's a repetitive sort of behavior that one projects on you, right? So it might just be a passing comment or remark, right? That the manager might have witnessed and they can address in that moment. But to say that it's on the onus of the manager to sort of address the bullying, it's sort of unfair to have that expectation. So I would say that the onus is on the employee to raise it, because you're the one that is actually feeling that uncomfortable behavior projected from another individual. So it's up to you to sort of take the necessary steps in order to address it. And then to answer in terms of actually addressing the bully, absolutely. So the thing about bullying, and even proving that you've been bullied in the workspace, it's quite challenging, right? Because I think even Jessie said it in her presentation with the example, it's not always obvious, right? So if it's been repeatedly done and you are feeling uncomfortable, I would say start off by documenting the experiences, jotting them down. It just has to, it can be in a note, capturing the emails or the paper trail that you're receiving. Maybe it might be on email, maybe it might be face-to-face. Reflect on those experiences or the engagements that you had with the bully and actually figure out, is it just me, or is there something here that's worth really investigating? And then once you have gathered your thoughts and obviously all your evidence, I would say engage with the bully, because sometimes people don't know that they are inappropriate and don't know that they are bullying. Sometimes, obviously, there will be smart bullies that know what they're doing and they'll play dumb. But sometimes people, as I'm saying, especially if it's a organizational culture to engage in that manner. If you address me and saying, you know, you're bullying me, I'm going to say to you, but everyone else engages that way, you know? So that's why I'm saying, yes, definitely approach the bully, make them understand how you're feeling and what you sort of accept and don't accept so that you can draw the line with them. That is the assertive skills that I was talking about earlier on.
Yes, thank you for that. If I may just add a little snippet there. as a manager or a leader of an organization or a department or an area, if you witness this and you don't deal with it, I think that it is a leadership failure. You absolutely should deal with it. Because as we know, staff will not always speak up, and often they feel a total different relationship of power than what you're experiencing. So dealing with it as and where it happens, I think is crucial, because if you don't do that, you tacitly accept it. There's another question for you, Bontle. I think your topic was obviously very popular. Do you think there is a link between bullying and micromanagement? How micromanagement should be handled in a workplace?
I think another great question here, putting me on the spot. Okay, so I think with regards to micromanaging, it's a very thin line, right? It's not obvious. The reason why I say that, if your manager, let's take out bullying out of the context here. If your manager is micromanaging you, it could be because of the first initial thing would be you're not performing. So the manager then suggests in their head that they need to actually hold your hand a little bit, right? And check in with you quite often in order to make sure that you're performing to what is required of you. So if you are being micromanaged, I would say the first thing is to actually engage honestly with your manager, because I think as leaders, sometimes they try to use a blanket approach in managing their staff. And some people, you do need to hold their hand a little bit in supporting them, but some people are pioneers and want to sort of not be micromanaged and be trusted that they can deliver on their work. So I'd say have an honest conversation with your manager and actually understand what is the expectations, where are you lacking, and what is the requirements for what you need to do. And make them know that after that agreement, if they're still micromanaging you, that it's making you feel uncomfortable, and what is it that they feel that they need to, what's the source and the cause of the micromanaging post that initial discussion of the what is your expectations. So that's what I'm saying. I wouldn't always initially take off micromanagement as being bullied, because when a manager micromanages you, it's usually due to poor performance. They directly have to check into you. But obviously it depends on how often, right? I would say that, and to what extent. So I wouldn't necessarily say micromanaging is bullying, but it can turn to bullying. Yeah.
Yeah, depending how you're obviously experiencing. If you don't know, ask.
Yes.
You know, and ask why it's taking place, and if you get good performance, performance appraisal or performance confirmation or negative comments or feedback, then you will know why the person is sitting on your shoulder and seeing that you actually need to do the work. I have a question here for Carlton. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
Did you see the question, or must I repeat it?
Is that the one in the chat box from Dominic?
Okay, let me repeat the question. What would you suggest to other organizations who are dealing with similar types of complexities with their communities or partner organizations who may not have similar codes of conduct as the ones developed by the organization, by your organization?
Yes, thanks, Dominic, for the question. Yeah, I think in our experience, what we've come to learn, and this is not going to be applicable for all organizations, but I think we've learned that it would be a good idea to try and put something in place that makes sense for the other parties as well. So for us, we have the benefit and luxury of having a social movement in place. And that social movement is in effect our connection to the community partners. So it's a little bit easier for us. I think what's coming up in my own mind is what happens in a situation, and maybe there are other, so I'm answering the question, but I'm also asking, because we're quite new in the journey, but what happens if you're an organization like ourselves that works with communities, but you don't have the luxury of an entity that you can actually work with to develop a code of conduct? What if it can be a whole lot of different community members or volunteers that can be in your space? Has anyone had experience in that? Because for us, the step we're taking is to develop a code of conduct that we can do in conjunction with the social movement. But I don't think all organizations have the luxury of doing that with what could be a very different set of volunteers that could just come in from all areas. So that's my answer, but it's also a question. I hope I'm allowed to pose that as well.
Dominique, would you like to follow up on that?
Thanks. I'm just unmuting myself. Thanks, Charlton. I think it's a really interesting response. I think that one of the things, and maybe it leads into your question, and maybe we can open this up as a broader question to other people in the other participants in the webinar, is I think that in both situations, there are very interesting power dynamics that happen between what are potentially formal organizations and grassroots or community-led organizations. And I think that that's having codes of conduct within those does become quite complex. So maybe my question is more of a statement, but just I think that power relation does lead to really interesting complexities. And then it also means that, you know, people might resist any kinds of policies because they feel like they're being told what to do by this kind of overarching organization. I'm hypothesizing. So maybe I'm just going to open that up for other panelists, or maybe the participants and audience on this webinar.
If there's anybody that would like to react on that, please just put your hand up. Okay, let's give them a little time to think. I have a question here which is addressed to all the panelists. So I'm going to read the question and then I will give Jesse, Bontley and Carlton opportunity to give the answers. For the rest of the audience, after this question and these answers, if there is anybody in the audience that would like to participate, make statements, ask questions, after that, please just put your hand up and I will give you the opportunity. So the question for the panelists is the following. South Africa has very high levels of violence and sexual gender-based violence and femicide. This is often normalized at a personal community level. How do you feel that the normalization of violence and SGBVF+, that long one, plays into bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace? Jesse, you are first up. Thanks.
Yeah, you know, we can leave many things behind when we go to work, but we can't leave ourselves behind. So obviously the environment that we spend a lot of time in shapes who we are and how we behave. And I suppose we definitely see the damage of just living in high violence environment and how our psyche responds to it, that we do tend to normalize that as well and become a little bit less sensitive to those things. Now, in positivist sometimes means when I look at my staff, how resilient they are, how things that would throw me completely, they seem to deal at ease, which worries me also, because it means that we kind of disassociate from ourselves, from our bodies, from what happens when we are under threat. And that's psychologically not a good thing and has physiological impact later on. Sexual violence, obviously the boundaries between what is healthy conduct. If that's very blurred at home or in your communities or areas where we come from, it does tend to come to work as well and obviously increase the chances of gross misconduct. On the positive side, I think if you have a healthy code of conduct and ways to address issues, we can also reverse some of these things and bring healing and better understanding and hopefully healthier boundaries.
Thank you, Jessie. Bontle?
Yeah, no, I definitely echo Jessie's statement there. I think what for me, which is, I'm going to make a very bold statement here. What I've seen, especially like we've had 1 or 2 incidents in our organization, is that it's sort of like, and it's because of what Jessie said, our organization obviously has the sort of policies, procedures, what is the expected behavior, what do we tolerate, what don't we tolerate, and everyone knows that. So I think the question of saying it's sort of like in the organizational space, what I've seen is that people are more aware of how they come across, especially with the sexual harassment. I think the bullying one is, we still have a long way to go, because as I'm saying, bullying is a quite difficult one to sort of prove. But if it's sort of like physical or I know even a couple of years ago, we dismissed somebody because he said a racial slur, like things like that, we take very seriously and we action on it. And it's sort of like within the organizational space, employees are aware of how they come across sometimes because they know that their job is on the line, right? And they know the rules and boundaries that we have in space. Whereas in our communities, as you're saying, it's sort of normalized. You hear somebody's been raped or killed, it's not so much of a shocker anymore, whereas it should be, right? And I think in our communities, we do like sort of that stringent and those, restraints again and reminders of that it's not normal to actually behave that way. So it's like a catch-22 when we back home, it's sort of like, okay, well, it happens, another incident in the community, whereas in the workplace, the way I'm seeing it is that people are more aware of how they come across. And what they say, they're more careful in the workspace, especially when they do have the necessary skills and policies in place. Whereas in our communities, it's not so much that way. So I think definitely there is a sort of a correlation, but also a distinguishing between the two from what I've seen, yeah.
Thank you. Colton, your contribution?
Yeah, so what's interesting for me is that, and I would agree there with Bontle, especially when she speaks about people coming into their work environment and knowing that, like she said, look, I think you said paycheck or salary is on the line, right? So you sort of know the things that you need to be looking out for. With us and the interesting spaces where we have this combination, because it's community and professional staff meeting in spaces. Of course, not all the community members or our social movement members have gone through what is the code of conduct for the organization. And like I said, they don't have anything in place. Sometimes we work with people who've actually never worked in a formal environment. The end result is, and we had this feedback from a couple of the regions where these safeguarding workshops were held. There was a recognition that some of the behavior towards themselves, so not even in interaction with professional staff, but just inside their own group, was directly related to the kinds of things that they are used to experiencing in their daily lives. And it's this trauma that's pervasive. And so it's normalized. And so it became, you actually got this moment of realization where you could say, well, actually, a person carrying that aggression or intention or to bully comes from a space because that's what they are surrounded with and fight almost every day. So yeah, I can see there's a definite link, and for us because the line is a little bit more blurred, it's not so clean cut. So we've had those slips where the incidents happen, where people have been bullied effectively with the language that you would easily find being shouted anywhere on a corner in the country, now being shouted in the office. So yeah, I can definitely see how that can transfer over.
Bontle, I have another question for you. What happens when organization doesn't have resources like transport, phones, computers? You have to rely on the other person who personally have such resources, and you find that where they are not responsible, they drag feet or make it difficult for you to do what needs to be done. And most time when trying to voice out challenges, you are told this is nonsense, or you need to work as adults, things like that, where it makes you feel like it is better to be quiet or afraid to say anything, or feel like you are seen as a problem or causing drama. I think you touched on that when you spoke about the HR system that
Yes.
to not be shared.
Yes, that's true.
Please.
Yeah, so I think that one it's within a structured organization, or organization that is, especially in the private sector that I sort of work in, is that these kind of things, obviously the resources and stuff, we make it quite clear when we engage somebody what they need, and we support them in that. So I think it's a bit challenging as an NGO organization, as you said, that there are times when you have to rely on other people. For my experience, and what I've also even told some of the people that report directly to me, is that whenever something is outside your control, it's always good to escalate upwards. So I would advise somebody who's in that situation, if you have addressed it with your manager that X, Y, and Z is your expectations in order for me to sort of work on whatever deliverables you might have, but you don't have, as you said, the basic resources in order to work on that, then you actually speak to your manager and say, I actually cannot work on what you need me to deliver on without A, B, and C, right? If your manager does not assist you, then you need to speak to your manager's managers or the next person in charge in order to intervene and assist you with this. So that's as well. And I also heard the comment there saying that you are told to, you feel like you need to restrain yourself and not actually say something. That also is a tactic of bullying, because obviously, I mean, it's a clear complaint, and or valid complaint rather. But I think in that regard, definitely involve other individuals who can assist you in that situation. I never believe in to obviously jump the line in terms of your direct reports. If your direct report doesn't help you, move to the next escalation process in order to actually get that assistance in terms of the resources especially. So sometimes you have to stand up from the crowd and make the noise that you're told to say you shouldn't make, right? So yeah, that's basically what I would say, because at the end of the day, if you're expected to deliver on something, but you don't have the basic resources, it's also an unfair labor practice in that sense. So yeah, I think definitely escalate and involve individuals who could assist you.
Thank you. Bontle, I have another one for you. What happens if the organization doesn't have any policies or procedures on bullying, as well as reporting guidelines? If one is being bullied in such an organization, what would you suggest?
Okay. So if I was working for such an organization without those structures to sort of support me, I think, as I said earlier, well, not I think, but as I indicated in my presentation, is I think the first thing a point is that you really need to start documenting the events, when they transfer, how they, so every Tuesday or every other day when I come into contact with this individual, a comment is made, or I am exposed in front of other people. So start to record and keep record of those events, when they happened and who was around. Because if I am sort of being bullied in front of a crowd, number one, I already have a witness, right? To verify my statement, to say that yes, on X date, I was, being shouted at in front of everybody and X, Y, and Z was said to me. If there isn't witnesses, that's also okay, right? Also document those instances. And I would say, give it perhaps a month to see, right? And the reason why, obviously, if it's severe bullying, right, don't wait until then. But if it's like a joke here, a comment there, I would say, and I think Leonie said it earlier, and address it in the moment, right? But if you feel like you're not sure if it's bullying or not, wait to see if it occurs. Because remember, I said that bullying is actually a repeated behavior that you experience from the next person, right? But if in the moment you are absolutely uncomfortable with the situation, address it there and then. And then once you've documented everything, as I said, you can refer to, first of all, address the person once you're ready. Involve your manager if needs be, and you feel like you're not ready to actually confront the bully themselves, because then the manager can do an informal process to actually try to resolve the bullying amongst themselves. And in that meeting or in your engagement session, that's when you can actually present your evidence that, on this date, this occurred, blah, 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 blah. And then obviously the bully will get an opportunity to sort of share their side of the events. Post that meeting and your manager is not able to assist you or stop the bullying, I would say literally approach the CCMA, because the CCMA can actually help you with an independent commissioner to handle the case at hand, right? And try to mediate the dispute between you and the bully. But as I said, it will be difficult to prove if you don't have enough evidence. Hence, I said document, save it, and then address it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bontle. Are there any questions, further discussions from the audience? I think, Dominique, you had one.
Thanks. I'm clearly quite vocal today. And this actually is aimed at, firstly, Charlton, and then I'm going to adjust the question for Jessie a little bit. So there was the question that was asked about what happens when organizations don't have resources like transport, phones, computers, and you have to rely on another person. I'm just going to continue. And you find that they drag their feet or make it difficult for you to do what needs to be done. And then when you try to voice these challenges, you're told that this is nonsense, or that you need to work as adults, and you feel like you are the problem or causing drama. So for Charlton, just given the complexities, excuse me, of working with social movements and other organizations, how would you deal with these kinds of challenges, given those relationships? And then Jessie, maybe to go to the end of the question, which is how would you ensure that people feel like they're safe to bring up issues, particularly so that they don't feel like they are seen as a problem or causing drama? And that's particularly around sexual harassment, but more broadly around safeguarding in general.
Thanks, Dominique. Okay, Carlton, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Dominic. I think it is a tough one on the resources side, and maybe, and I'm hoping I'm understanding the question correctly. One of the things that we've tried to do is to be quite transparent about how the access to certain resources work. So there, what's very funny, and maybe it's a learning for us as well, is that we actually have quite a good system for how the financials and resources work across these divide, formal versus formal. And it's making me realize how we didn't actually pay enough attention to the other stuff. But usually it's because donors and your board and other people are more interested on the finances side. So you tend to focus on that one quite well. So we've got a good process in place for how people are meant to access resources and how to even request it. Your question does remind me, though, that you still get scenarios where people can almost be like gatekeeping those resources. So it's like the question that I ask myself is, how transparent is transparent? Because especially around accessing financial resources, it's not always easy to say to everyone, here's the budgets, you can all see what you can access, go for it. It's not as simple as that. But yeah, so I think my answer is that yes, we do have quite good systems in terms of how resources can be accessed. But at the same time, I can still see how there's room for having these problems, because we've experienced it where you get, and I don't want to say lower level, but groups that might not be linked into a particular leadership that might not know all that information. So information sharing is key. And it's also making me realize that we've got such a robust administrative and finance system that speaks across the two, the formal and informal. But we still have to put all that in place in terms of the policies around bullying and code of conduct and safeguarding. So your question sparked an interesting thought in my mind, something for us to look at.
Happy to be of assistance. Thank you, Jesse.
If I understood you correctly, Dominic, you were saying kind of like, how do we ensure that people do share their concerns, or when things go wrong, how do we ensure that they feel safe? Was that your question?
Yes, that's my question.
So I suppose organizational values, there should be some kind of organizational culture already that says in a bigger voice that safety is important, and that the organization has thought of mechanisms how one can report cases. And when you report, obviously there has to be confidentiality, so I can raise my concerns in an environment that I know that my privacy will be protected. But also we would always make sure that you have trained personnel who are in those positions. Now, this can be clinically trained like social workers or auxiliary social workers, but we can also have peers, like trained peer support specialists, who sometimes are perhaps in a position where people find it easier to go and raise concerns. Like our clients tend to want to speak to somebody they trust and who they know understands them. And sometimes the jump to a clinical expert might be bigger. So, but as long as it's trained, and the trained basically means that you are able to conduct that conversation in a way that's non-judgmental, that respects the person's dignity, that allows them to share everything they have in their mind. So active listening and all those kinds of skills that either come in clinical training or, for instance, in our case, the peer supporters. And we know that, like, it sounds strange, but when somebody is being harmed in some way, often the response is that there must be something wrong with me. So you really have to affirm that person, that it's okay to raise things. You don't have to always have all the proof. We want you to feel safe. If you don't feel safe, there's a problem, regardless of what has happened. And that we tell everybody that we take that very seriously.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions, remarks, contributions? Good. It seems that we have reached the end of our webinar. I would like to say thank you to everybody, especially the three presenters. You obviously hit the spot, if one can see from the reaction from the audience and the many questions that there were. As we know, this is such a complex topic or topics. There's actually 2 topics, and we learn as we go along, and hopefully we will reach a point where we can say the work is done. But dealing with the environment, especially in South Africa, will never be easy, and we need to be strong for that. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you for the preparation that you did, and thank you for being with us here today. And we hope that you also got something out of it. To the Afrika Tikkun team who actually arranged this, thank you very much. Thank you for your big work, big job behind the scenes. One knows that a webinar, you don't just decide about 9 o'clock and run it at 10 o'clock. It takes a lot of input. Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience, and we hope that we all learned something today. Good afternoon to everybody.
Thanks, Leonie.
Thank you. Bye.